Ok, senhores, nós estamos ao vivo. Eu só vou reduzir a minha tela aqui. Deixa eu ver como é que eu faço para... Ah, tá ok. Podem dar início à live, tá? Agora nós estamos ao vivo, tá bom? Eu vou ficar aqui atento, mas já está valendo, tá bom? Tchau, tchau.
Ciao, ciao.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is a pleasure and an honor to open the 7th edition of the VII BRICS annual conference. And this is particularly true having as our keynote speech today, opening session, Ottaviano Canuto. We had the pleasure of and the honor of having Ottaviano Canuto with us in previous editions. And again, he will soon deliver his speech. Ottaviano Canuto is Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, Principal at Center for Macroeconomics and Development, and Non-Resident Fellow at Brookings Institute. He is the former Vice President and Executive Director at the World Bank, Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund, and Vice President at the Inter-American Development Bank. He was also Deputy Minister for International Affairs at Brazil's Ministry of Finance, as well as Professor of Economics at University of São Paulo, USP, and the University of Campinas, Unicamp. My dear Ottaviano Canuto, it's a pleasure having you with us again. You have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Paulo. It's really a pleasure to be back here and accompany over the years the realization of the work of this group, which is a very interesting and productive channel of exchange of views, and so let me first congratulate the group for what the group has been doing. Let me do the following. Let me give my take on my personal experience relative to the BRICS. Since when I was at the Brazilian government, the BRICS did not exist as such. But the fact of the matter is that over my successive functions at the multilateral institutions, both on the staff side as vice president and also at the board, being elected by 9 countries, including one BRIC, Brazil, I had the opportunity to accompany very closely the beginning, how the BRICS worked within the multilateral institutions. And now that I retired from these institutions, I remain an observer and accompanying the evolution and the things done on the context of the BRICS. So let me, I believe that my own take may give you the angle on particularly on what's now this current stage of evolution of the BRICS. Okay. So initially, I don't have to tell you the story that, of course, you guys know quite well, but let me pinpoint that when the idea of gathering the original BRICS countries into a group, the main, let's say, target at the time was to boost the position of the bargaining power of these countries into the multilateral institutions, not only during capital increase campaigns, not only during times of adjustment in the IMF quotas, but also, on a more routinely based, when I was at the board at both institutions on the two sides of the 19th Street here in Washington, at the IMF and the World Bank, we had a dynamics, the executive directors representing the 5 countries, to get together and discuss, and occasionally, or most often, take joint positions with respect to whatever came to the board in terms of changes in policies and specific issues. Let me tell you that not necessarily we had a consensus, and I will give you a couple of examples. But the fact of the matter is that the perception by all the other executive directors was such that they saw the BRICS as a group that had a certain voting power at the boards of these institutions, well beyond what individually the countries had. So it was significant in this case, particularly when, as I said, there was a consensus. So the original idea, we all know the story, it was to boost the power, the voice of these countries, and it succeeded in the sense that both in the IMF quota increase in 2010, and also over the 2 capital increase campaigns that took place since then at the World Bank side. And by the way, in the case of the World Bank, the first capital increase in the last decade, I was VP. I was one of the vice presidents at the World Bank, and the president of the World Bank at the time, Bob Zoellick, always, consulted with me, always, took into account what I would say regarding the dynamics of the group. But then later on, I also interacted with. Then I was, when I moved to the board, I went to the IMF, left the staff position, and by the way, before leaving the staff position as VP and going to the IMF, the president of the bank, the new president of the bank, made me as well a special advisor on BRICS economies. This position has not been replaced, but at the time when the Jim Kim, the successor to Bob Zoellick, was there, he decided to give me this additional function officially, and so on. So I moved to the board of the IMF, and then the picture changed, of course, because then I was apologies, I'm feeling a cold today. It was I went back to the articulation among executive directors and talking to governments. Now, in 2018, the latest capital increase at the World Bank, it became clear that there would be some limits up to which the endeavor to increase the share of the BRICS countries in the capital structure of the World Bank, as well as in the quota structure of the IMF, would reach a limit. It's incredible how, for instance, in the case of the 2018 capital increase of the World Bank, the whole package was finalized over a weekend in a hotel here in Chesapeake Bay. We were all in retreat to try to get a deal. I must confess that in the beginning I was a bit pessimistic because the U.S. government at the time, the Assistant Secretary David Malpass, who later would say became president of the World Bank, at a certain moment said to the to a Congress committee that there would be no additional money coming from the US to the World Bank unless China was graduated to cease to be a client to the World Bank. And that was not a good thing, because by any criterion, upgrading China would also mean upgrading all other upper middle income countries, including Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and other ones. Whereas the position of our capital has been the one of, even if in some criteria we might fulfill the bill for being upgraded to let's say a country no longer client of the IBRD. Fact of the matter is that it is not our interest to close this door. We want to keep it open, even nowadays. And the fact of the matter is that announcement by David Malpass to congressmen kind of threw a cold water in our objective of raising capital, given the size of the United States as a single stakeholder, as a single shareholder. Fortunately, at the end of the weekend, I will never forget that Sunday afternoon when we, all the other executive directors stayed, by the swimming pool or by other place at the hotel, waiting for the outcome of a meeting between China and Japan. Yes, China and Japan. And I explained. The other Part 1 countries, that is to say the donor countries, the countries that are not client, the graduated, they came to this picture with a very much differentiated stance. For instance, the UK demanded quotas, demanded the establishment of ceilings to how much of the money could be lent to upper middle income countries, including 3 of the 5 BRICS. Whereas the French came with a demand of a differentiated pricing, that is to say, to charge higher fees for the upper middle income countries on the verge of graduation with higher fees, and whereas the Japanese were also part of this same team, and the Scandinavians and the Germans had a different stance, because the Scandinavians and the Germans believe that having the bank operating with upper middle income countries is still relevant with respect to global public goods. So their position was quite different. But of course, US, France, UK, and Japan were, sizable enough to block any conclusion of the agreement. Were not for some acceptance of their terms. And by the way, the BRICS were split in this regard, because India had recently upgraded from IDA, from the status of low income country, that is to say, liable to receive the grants and very much subsidized finance that characterizes the operations of the International Development Agency, to be accepted as a lower middle income. And so it's interesting, in 20 years that I spent, 15 years that I spent in those institutions, only once the Minister of Finance of India came to the Development Committee meetings. And it was to relay the message that India accepted the graduation, but with a guarantee that there would be lending space for India. So in this case of the capital increase, the position of India was something like in favor of what the British, the French, and the Japanese and the U.S. Ultimately, the U.S. Ended up accepting the final package. David Malpass appeared at the last meeting over the weekend in Chesapeake Bay, and so they all closed the deal in this regard, and we had to accept. The deal was made, and we had to accept a higher price for lending to upper middle income countries. We had to accept the establishment of a reasonable demand of limits to how much money the upper middle income countries could get of the lending space of IBRD. And also, we accept the idea that periodically all these countries would establish conversations with the management of the institution to discuss the possibility of upgrade, the possibility of a graduation into a non-client position. Okay. But the reason why the deal had to wait for a meeting between China and Japan, while everybody else was waiting, of course, Japan in this regard was very much in sync with the other major shareholders, of course, was that according to the rules, this is quite important, according to the formula that the board of executive directors had established about what should be the shares of capital to each country, and there are some criteria, but the most important one is the per capita income level and the size of the economy. China should have, let's say, or would be entitled to have 10% of the capital of the bank. But that would make China the second largest shareholder, bypassing Japan. Japan, who had 7% of the capital of the bank. So China had to accept, and the whole deal was only possible because of the acceptance by China, go to 6%. Just to give you an idea, the constituency led by Brazil, where I was sitting at the time, corresponded to something close to 3.75% of the capital of the bank. US 16%, and there you go. Summing up, the US and Europeans, they make up a little bit more than 50% of the capital of the bank, as they do in the case of the IMF. And that's why they have managed over the existence of these institutions to nominate always an European to the IMF and an American to the World Bank. American in a broad sense of the term. Nationalized Americans also work for that, as the current one, as Jim Kim, and as in the past we had also Wolfson. Anyway, this event that happened in 2018 with respect to the capital increase was, in fact, it had been to a large extent anticipated in the previous negotiations about the IMF in 2010 and also at the World Bank in 2011, 2012. Namely, there would be some limits to the level to which the non-European and non-US and non-Japan members could go. The majority, which gives the full power in some issues, not the veto power. The veto power, the only one that has individually is the US, but the Europeans, when they get together, they also reach a level of voting power that provides the possibility of vetoing and so on. But the fact of the matter, it became clear that with respect to the multilateral institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, there would be a limit. And not by chance, that's when, prior to that, in the beginning of the decade, as you know, the BRICS I mean, and realize, okay, so if we have a limit to how up we go in these institutions, and this limit may make more difficult the increase of capital of these institutions, because if you have the rules, and if you increase the capital, it becomes harder to bypass the rules that would lead to another outcome. And by the way, this is going to be, as always, an issue to be dealt with the agenda, the ongoing agenda of a new capital increase or any reformulation of the multilateral institutions that has received the first step now in Marrakesh during the annual meetings. So this is an issue that is still, remain relevant. Now, so the BRICS say, okay, then let's create our own bank where we will not face this kind of limit. And the NDB, the New Development Bank, was created with equal shares of 20% originally for the 20 for the 5 BRICS. What ended up limiting the size of the NDB? China wanted an even larger NDB, but that would make difficult for the other BRICS to keep the share and so on. And the solution was the negotiation led to a size of the NDB that made possible the maintenance of the equal shares for each one of the 5 members. But also, and then the Chinese say, okay, I will create another one. That's when the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank came to the fore, and China created it and opened it. The Europeans jumped in to be as well part of it. Obama made the mistake, in my view, of staying aside. But the fact of the matter is that the AIIB, in this case, with a higher stake, a higher predominance of China, but nonetheless, the Europeans accepted quite well to be there, as they do in the case of the Asian Development Bank, as with the point that Asian Development Bank is mostly dominated by Japan and the US. The fact of the matter is that the AIIB was created as part of this new configuration of multilateral institutions. We also know, in this case, what I'm going to say is not from someone who was, in this case, accompanying closely, but there were those who had even the ambition of having the BRICS creating a parallel IMF, an IMF, as we say in Brazil, an IMF do be, IMF, an alternative IMF, and an agreement of sharing reserves was enacted, like several others that have become a common trait of the provision of international liquidity nowadays. But interestingly, with the requirement that any use of the space, the landing space by the facility would have to be accompanied by, after a certain threshold, it would have to be accompanied by an IMF program. So in practice, this killed the idea of having an alternative IMF, and indeed, but the NDB is there, and is warming up and working and facing its specific challenge. Let me say something as well, based on my own experience, on the following. The immediate fear in the international development community was the risk of conflict of rules, of safeguards, conflict of standards among these differentiated multilateral institutions, in between the Bretton Woods institutions and the other ones. And by the way, The NDB and the AIIB were not the only ones. We have seen since then the expansion of CAF, of the Development Bank of Latin America. We saw a boost in the Islamic Development Bank. We saw not so much on the regional development banks, the ones coming from the generation of the Bretton Woods institutions, like the IDB and ADB and the African Development Bank, but we saw the boost of other multilateral institutions. So the major fear was the fact that we might have a sort of a competition of safeguards with undermining the discipline, the effectiveness of safeguards. Safeguards, I mean, environmental, social, and governance safeguards that have been embedded in the operations of the World Bank, for instance. But despite these fears of conflict, I had the privilege of being a participant, a testimony of a cooperation. And I explain. The World Bank was working on a project in Manila, in the Philippines, on a sanitation project and water management in the canals that cut across the city of Manila, where you have very poor people living on the margins and under risks and really in dire conditions. Like we had in Brazil, in Salvador. Salvador had an area that it was exactly like that. And the World Bank had financed and operated, together with the Brazilian government, a project in Salvador, Bahia, that revamped the whole thing. A beautiful one. I visited the area in 2004, and then I visited the area in 2013. And I was amazed to see how people had been relocated from those dangerous areas to houses nearby, how the sanitary conditions had really been changed because of the project. So the World Bank took the same team and brought to Manila to do a similar thing in Manila. And it worked well. I visited Manila at the last stage of the conclusion of this project. And guess what? Then the AIIB knocks on the door and asks, can I join you guys? And everybody was happy. It was a triple win for the World Bank, because there were limits to how far the lending could go, given the caps for countries in the allocation of resources of the World Bank. The Filipinos were happy because they had more money for such an important project. And the AIIB was happy because it added to its portfolio a superb project and learned, and to have the opportunity to learn with the execution of the project. So that gave me, let's say, I like to quote as example on how cooperation may prevail over competition, right? And but then, so that was the main mission and the main outcomes of the BRICS until then. It's important to retain this. The BRICS were created having in mind the Bretton Woods. Then it evolved towards creating its own institutions of development, and also as naturally the executive directors at the boards on both sides of the 19th Street here in Washington. There is a tunnel below the World Bank headquarters and the IMF headquarters, which is very convenient over during the winter days. You don't have to put a coat to cross the street. And we had this articulation. But as I said, not always, not consensus 100% of the times. I give you already an example in the capital increase negotiation on the World Bank side, where India aligned with the US and the Europeans, and with the UK, France, and Japan, to demand the guarantee of space of lending for them. Okay, so when we had, interestingly, the dynamics of these negotiations, for specific reasons, given my own experience, and I kind of became the leader of the countries concerned with the issue of graduation. So and naturally I became the center organizing the meetings among our constituency. And by the way, our constituency had also low-income countries like Haiti and lower middle-income countries like the Philippines, who had sympathy with the position of India. But the majority of our constituency, including the major shareholder there present, Brazil, wanted to strike against the graduation. So I called the meetings, organized the meetings with the constituency led by Canada, that had many middle-income countries from Central America, from the Caribbean, and also the constituency that had led by Mexico and Spain, that had many Central American countries, and the other constituency of Colombia, Chile, Argentina, also. And in my meetings, I had the presence of the Belgian ED and also of the Dutch ED. Why? Because their constituencies include several Eastern European middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, who also prefer to maintain the open door of non-graduation. Okay, so we didn't have a consensus among BRICS in that regard, but there were other instances. Let me give you an example. I know I'm looking at the clock, but I hope these experience that I'm saying, they will illustrate what I want to say at the very end. Now, another topic where there was no consensus among the BRICS was at my time at the IMF. The IMF had a rule, had this is a policy rule, that the IMF was prohibited of lending money to a country in default if the country is not negotiating, is not in good faith, negotiating with the creditor countries, particularly the official creditor side. Namely, that ended up being the Club of Paris, which you may know, of course you know, is this group of official creditors to developing countries. They get together regularly in Paris, not by chance, the Paris Club, and in which, let's say, try to coordinate their positions to avoid the stalemate of competition among the shareholders, among the creditor countries. They're facing default on the debtor country side, and so the norm of the IMF, which in practice is read by saying that, no lending if a country is in pure default without an open negotiation. And then suddenly the shareholders, the major shareholders, wanted to suspend this rule, or in fact to overcome this rule. And there was one reason. The reason was the following. We're talking about 2015. Ukraine had defaulted on Russia. And and the major shareholders wanted the IMF to help Ukraine, but that was not possible under the rules, given the default, without negotiation at the time between Ukraine and Russia, 2015, I'm talking. And so the major shareholders wanted to overcome this rule. Guess what? Of course, the major opposer was Russia, but then suddenly, which already broke the BRICS, right? Also, to our surprise, to my surprise, or to many of surprise, China also objected the overcoming the rule. What? China getting orthodox, such as this, and also together with China against that proposition was Saudi Arabia. What? Saudi Arabia and China, and the BRICS is split because our position, the Brazilian and my other shareholders, my other members of the constituency, as well as South Africa, and the BRICS, they were split with China and Russia on the one side, vis-a-vis all the others, South Africa, Brazil, and India, in favor of the relaxation of the rule. And we went to the vote and separate votes, of course, and the rule was overcome, and the IMF was able to lend resource to Ukraine. And by the way, before any of you may think of, well, is this sort of a Club of Paris, some sort of creditors unfair practice? Look at the following: the major impediment to negotiations of around defaults is the coordination, is the minimum, is to have creditors sitting at the table at the same time. That's why the call has been very strong more recently with the inevitable debt restructuring processes that are taking place in many developing countries, that China has to sit at the table. Because if the major creditors are not at the table simultaneously, individually, a creditor becomes afraid that it might be a sucker. I am a creditor, I offer a debt relief, but if the other creditor does not give anything, then the other creditor will get away without any concession because of my concession. So this is an acknowledged problem of collective action that accompanies any debt negotiation, be it on the corporate side, on the private sector side, be it in this kind of negotiations. So you have to have the bulk of the creditors minimally signaling to each other what they are willing to accept, so as to have the offers to take place. So it makes sense to have something like the Club of Paris, and it makes even more sense to have a minimum coordination between the official creditors of OECD and China in the current times where China has become a major creditor. Now, but that episode, okay, returning back to the episode of the reason why China and Saudi Arabia didn't want the rule to be overcome is simple fact that they are now creditors. China, a major creditor, not only in some countries in Latin America, but also in Africa. And obviously, they didn't want the weakening of the position of the creditor, because if the IMF can lend, if the country in default can take money from the IMF, that boosts the bargaining power of the debtor country relative to creditors. So, yeah, and it's incredible how, and by the way, in another moment at which it became clear that not necessarily we had full consensus. The thing is the following. 2015, at the IMF, the American executive director makes a reference during one of our board meetings to how welcome would be the consideration, a new process of judgment whether China's renminbi should be part of the SDR, of the accounting money of the IMF, the basket of SDRs, something that had been analyzed in 2010 and denied and refuted back into. And so the SDRs, sovereign drawing rights, they are reviewed each 5 years, and at the time, 2010, the renminbi was not judged to be, let's say, liable to be part of the basket. The basket had the dollar, the US dollar, the sterling pound, the euro, and the Japanese yen. And there are some criteria that guide the discussion, the decision. Share of the currency in trade transactions. In that case, China's renminbi already was fulfilling entirely, but less so in the other two criteria, which are on financial transactions. The share of the renminbi in international global financial transactions was still very low, and is still, in relative terms, not comparable to the other ones. And the third criterion, easy to comply, was to have public debt, public securities of the country being negotiated in at least two of the major financial centers of the world, namely Hong Kong, London, and New York. And at the time, the renminbi, there were only public debt negotiated in Hong Kong, but not in London and in New York. But that criterion was easy to surpass. Yes, okay, let me continue. Then when the signal given by the US opened the process, and the renminbi was a candidate, then we went through the exam and so on, the recommendations of the IMF, and the China's renminbi was approved and incorporated as one of one new currency to be part of the basket of the SDRs. The issuance in London was easy to do, and of course, as I said, the criterion of share of the renminbi in trade transactions, global trade transactions, was also easy to obtain. The third one, on financial transactions, a goodwill was necessary in order to have the Chinese currency approved. Anyway, why this comes to my mind? The language of the IMF, the language of the USED at the time, was something like, China. Let's take this as a G2 negotiation. Forget about this rest. And interestingly, I'm going to tell you the following. Along that process, China did not come to our BRICS meetings at the IMF. Stayed cool. Well, and there was as well the issue of the debt, overcoming the restriction to IMF lending for countries in default and so on. But the fact of the matter is that when I was later on the back to the World Bank side as executive director, things were more normalized. But I want to illustrate to you the following, and I'm running to my end. These BRICS, like G7, in a broader way, G20, or other similar associations, they serve a double purpose. They serve either as a forum through which enhance cooperation among the constituent countries, and also, of course, whenever there is a commonality of positions with respect to some global issue, having the BRICS, or as the G7 does, that boosts the position, the negotiating position abroad. But that's it. They do not replace individual countries. They do not necessarily reach 100% consensus, as I illustrated in several examples here in my talk. But that's their finality. And given the stage of at which the main, let's say, or the second main outcome of the BRICS has been attained, the construction and establishment of alternative multilateral development banks, and now the doubt is interesting is what's next? What next? What next beyond that? And that leads us to exactly the expansion of the BRICS agreed this year. Let's keep in mind consensus only when there is consensus that the joint strength is enhanced. Any one of us who have accompanied quite closely the evolution of the international monetary system, we recall how in the beginning of the 80s, what is now the G7 was riddled with extreme disputes about the exchange rate positions of the dollar vis-a-vis the German and then Bundesbank currency, and Japan, and the dispute was tough. So you don't have necessarily even consensus among G7 countries and so on. And the same applies to the BRICS. By the way, if the NDB, of course, suffered a stroke with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That immediately led to a downgrade of risk ratings of the NDB, given that 20% of its capital belongs to a country that clearly under restrictions and so on. And Madame Dilma Rousseff is having to deal, like her predecessor, with how to raise funds without depending on the markets upon which the other multilateral development banks take the money. You have to keep this in sight. Look, the capital of these institutions corresponds, in the case of the World Bank, for instance, to 20% of the lending, okay? 20%. The difference, the 80% of lending above what the size of the capital is made by taking money in the markets, by issuing bonds. And given the callable capital, given the promise by shareholders that if need be, they put money, and given as well the priority given to repayment in the countries to loans from the World Bank, this is signed in the agreements of the World Bank. Fact of the matter is that the World Bank managed to borrow money in the markets, paying interest rates very close to the Federal Reserve Bank. That's how the World Bank managed to lend money with at fees below the market for the countries. So this possibility got hampered, got constrained in the case of the NDB, given the situation of a major shareholder and the downgrades in markets. And not by chance, President Dilma has been looking for alternative ways of financing in local currency markets and so on. Anyway, the NDB has reached, and that's how I understand the extension of the NDB, the extension of the BRICS this year, including the new members. And again, the double agenda will be there, of course. That is to say, cooperation on the one side, whenever possible, in whatever areas that cooperation may be enhanced, and on the other, boosting the position vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Now, the inward agenda will definitely has two obvious points. One of them, the extension, the widening of the NDB, that's obvious. And the other one is the further development of the use of local currencies in international trade, which is an agenda pursued by China through wide. Any of you interested in this subject, I have recently produced a short paper, a short article on the results of the previous of the last BRICS summit, describing what is to be attained, what are the reaches, potential reaches and limits of the use of local currencies and so on. But that's clearly an agenda that's quite much of interest to China, in the sense that the Central Bank of China has established bilateral agreements with many countries. And by the way, it was one of those signed with Argentina and boosted in 2014 that allowed Argentina to avoid the default with the IMF 2 months ago. It's less clear which gains are to be accrued by Brazil in this respect. Brazil has, for instance, a tendency of in the case of China, of a structural surplus. And so the agreement with China, if enacted to comprehend 100% of the bilateral transactions, will mean that with respect to the financial and commercial relations between Brazil and China, Brazil will accumulate reserves in renminbi, at least the portion of the bilateral relation, rather than in dollars. And of course, renminbi are not yet as widely used currency as it is the case of the dollar. So when it comes to liquidity, it is not a gain for Brazil, but there are other reasons. Brazil, in the past, some of you may know that Latin America tried one mechanism of use of local currencies as a way to economize on the necessity of storing reserves in dollars. Ultimately, the compensation of the transactions was in dollar, but the need for stockpiling dollars would be lower if you don't have to exchange each and every transaction among the countries into dollars. But unfortunately, there were defaults in Venezuela and so on, and the whole scheme was disrupted. So in terms of economizing reserves in hard currency, this kind of use of local currencies to settle bilateral trade payments makes sense. But in the case of Brazil, it's not clear what would be the gain in stockpiling reserves in renminbi rather than in dollars in this case. But obviously, as well, the use of local currencies, something extremely convenient for any country subject to sanctions, to U.S. sanctions, or even European sanctions. And that Russia quite happy, of course, with the enactment of such a clearly Argentina, at least, provided that Milei does not win the elections in 2 weeks. Also happy with the arrangement. It has been extremely helpful for Argentina. Of course, a lot of the others will also be very much happy with that, with a ring fest. But so there is a mutual gain to be pursued by many of those countries, not necessarily the case of India, but anyway, that's an agenda that came forth immediately. The other, and I finalize with that, the other dimension, that is to say, in the relationship between the countries, the agenda, BRICS, BRICS plus, BRICS extended, is where, let's say, we must be aware of. Is not to be, or it shouldn't be, I don't believe it would be in the interest of members like Brazil and India to be some sort of a confrontation. I found it very much, let's say, notable how the Russian authorities talked about de-Westernization accompanying the expansion of the BRICS. I don't believe this is the agenda that is, let's say, to be taken as to which Brazil, India, and Argentina, and if Argentina confirms, right, or even Ethiopia and South Korea and South Africa and so on are aligned with. Let's not get captured by this discourse, because then the BRICS become part of the rivalry, the biggest one being U.S. China, or U.S. Europe and China, as you will, as a chapter of this rivalry, because I strongly believe that the Brazilian interest is in keeping the multipolarity, not any alignment, either specifically with the U.S. nor with China. We must, I believe, and I pretty believe that this is also the undertaking in India, mirror at dispute me, what do you have to offer me, so that we exchange, and no alignment, let's say, helps in that regard. Sorry for speaking too much, but it's such a see, in a nutshell, the future of the BRICS Plus, given the already established agenda with respect to financial institutions and with respect to the next chapter is one that will, with the local use of the use of local currencies. The next stage must be particularly to highlight the cooperation side and obtaining consensus wherever it is possible, but without being in detriment to the relations of the individual member countries of the BRICS Plus and the whole global sphere. Thank you, Paul, and sorry for talking long.
Thank you so much, Taviano Canuto. And you have already anticipated the question I would like to ask you on how you see BRICS Plus can work. But thank you. And it will be interesting in a year, so next year, to see, after the 6 new countries join in, how you will evaluate the picture. But if you are kind enough to answer, we have three questions that have been forwarded by the audience. The first one, what is, in your opinion, on BRICS expansion and how can it influence transactions with national currencies? Do you think BRICS participation in financial institutions has favored a change of macroeconomic positions of those institutions? This is the first one. You prefer to have the three in a row, or?
Let me answer these two, and
okay,
if I may. Sorry, starting from the second, there has been no change in macroeconomic policies in these institutions. And by the way, look, didn't surprise you to know that China at the IMF was against making easier for debtor countries in default to borrow money from the IMF. Didn't it surprise you that the toughness with which China has acted in the bilateral negotiations that it prefers with debtor countries? So don't be, there is no such a thing. This is very, very much, I would say, naive and wrong to believe that is something like the North is austere and the South is in favor of relaxed policies. There's no, this is not correct. You, this is not appropriate. So the macroeconomic recommendations and policies recommendations, sorry, have not changed, and they will not. And that applies as well to the whatever happens between the institutions of the BRICS and their debtor countries. Maybe with a higher leeway for debtors, given the shareholding participation of the debtor countries, those countries will take money from the NDB. But there is no change in policies. Paulo, and by the way, the good thing is that regarding China, much was said, particularly by the Americans trying to convince Latin America not to take money from China. I live in Washington, have lived for 20 years. And in the last 5 to 10 years, I have been called to participate in meetings, in events and so on. And typically Americans came and said, don't take money from China. You know, there is a debt trap. There is the risk. And by the way, they relaxed on safeguards, on environmental and social and governance safeguards. So they will feed corruption and so on. So many times, I heard, and I kind of repeated what authorities from the region always said. Okay, so what is the alternative that you Americans offer, right? And by the way, I read, I had the chance, fortunately, I have co-authors and partners, Chinese. One of them helped me translate the orientation given by the government to Chinese investors abroad to really up the stance, up the ante on ESG because of the losses that China had with some lending in the region and with the reaction, the popular reaction, the copper mine in Peru, as well as problems in Ecuador and so on. So now even the Chinese are, as well as in Africa. So now the Chinese are upping the ante with respect to ESG standards as well. So I don't see much of a difference in terms of stance. Paulo, the first question, if I may.
Oh, yeah. In fact, this was a double question from the same person. The first part of it was, what is your opinion on BRICS expansion, and how can it influence transactions with national currencies?
Right. No, definitely the main area of immediate change, progress, it will be in the use of local currencies, because not that is necessary. China has been establishing agreements bilaterally with whatever countries are willing to. Just give an idea, how many 150, 120 bilateral agreements the PBOC has already established with countries of Asian facility. So, but of course, having the grouping, having them within the group with regular meetings and so on, with regular instances of communication and the coordination, it will make easier the use of local currencies, which will lead to a higher use of local currencies at the end of each year, or whatever be the period established as the reference for settlement, depending on the bilateral trades. As I said, Brazil has a structural trade surplus with China, and even with the investment, even with the investments from China that come through the fiscal havens and so on, even so, the fact of the matter is that bilaterally, Brazil tends to accumulate reserves in renminbi. But that will not be the case in Argentina. Argentina has a deficit. So definitely that will be an increase in the use of local currencies. What else in terms of agenda? And in terms of it will be a matter of finding the ways by which you may have the cooperation among these countries. Again, not joint positions in all respect vis-a-vis the G7 or whatever.
Okay. Yes. So the second question, Professor Canuto, what is your view on the future dynamics of the BRICS and possible economic joint developments among all members? They are not members, the participants. And once we have in the same group countries with long-standing geopolitical confrontation.
Yes. That's obviously a complicator. Because, as I said, the BRICS Plus, I am truly a believer that for most of the countries, including Brazil, most of the members, is not to become an alternative pole against. Of course, we talk about G20, okay, G20 Plus now with the African community. In there, the G7 very often coordinates their positions, which also, of course, means that the BRICS or BRICS Plus may also coordinate their positions, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. This is undeniable. But the point to make is that the BRICS Plus cannot become, otherwise that would not be of the interest of some of its members, including Brazil and India and South Africa, to be entangled into the geopolitical frictions between US and China, Russia, and so on. Definitely, as a Brazilian, I don't think this is the best path for Brazil.
Yes, yes. But it will be interesting to see how two Muslim countries, one Sunnite and one Shiite, will work together in the BRICS Plus environment.
If that helps peace among them, the better.
Sure, sure. And the third question, not abusing your patience and goodwill. Professor Canuto, you mentioned in an article that the growing use of local currencies in external payments will be part of, quote, slow and bounded de-dollarization, unquote.
Yes.
How could this lead to a partial fragmentation of the global payment system?
Right. Well, that's a good question. And the slow and bounded dollarization comes from the fact that, you know, it's a number, it's a fact. The share of renminbi used in global transactions has risen, is the one rising, but still remaining at levels, as anyone can see in a chart that I have in my article, with a certain limit, 5%, because the leap, the change of status, the change of size of the renminbi as a global currency will only happen when private investors, when the rest of the world feel confident on that they would be able to access and liquidate their positions in assets, in Chinese assets, when they will. And interestingly, of course, despite the US and European sanctions on Russia, despite the US sanctions on Venezuela, despite the US sanctions on Iran, the confidence on having access at the creditors' will to dollar-denominated assets has not diminished. So China clearly has not made it a priority to go that path right now, and I take the opportunity to illustrate why by referring. Remember, I spoke about the SDRs and the entry of the renminbi, and one in 2015, starting in 2016. And one of the requirements established by the IMF was a communication, a connection between the financial markets in Hong Kong and in Hong Kong, China, as we at the World Bank are trained to say, in Hong Kong, China, and mainland China. And when that happened, in a matter of weeks, we had the exit of $300 billion, the equivalent in renminbi to $300 billion from China. And why? Because the Chinese investors, like any other in the world, want to diversify their wealth. They want to have assets not just in one currency, in one area. That happens to the Brazilian ones and so on. And the Brazilian rich has not only assets in Brazil, but assets abroad as well. And that outflow, sudden outflow, as my Chinese executive director colleague at the board, when I asked him what was happening, he said, it's Chinese money leaving Chinese hands to Chinese hands. That is to say, the public sector to the private sector. But it was so scary that China returned with some capital controls. And so it looks like the China's stance will be to advance as much as possible with the use of the renminbi in currencies, as it's doing in official transactions through the agreements among central banks, etc., but without opening the capital account, at least not for the time being. And having said so, well, being so, there is a limit to which this ongoing de-dollarization and increase of renminbi will take place. That's what I had in mind with the conclusion of my article. And the complement, Paulo, of the question was on.
Yes, it was on the. Just a moment. Sorry.
Yeah.
How could this lead to a partial fragmentation of the global payment system?
Fantastic. Because obviously, if the corresponding payment frameworks do not communicate, then the global settlement that is obtained, for instance, or almost global through SWIFT, so this platform, will be, let's say, made harder if alternative platforms occupy the space and you don't some space, and then you don't have the communication. That is a risk and a potential problem, because one loses efficiency of payments if that happens.
Okay, certainly. So this is was a great opening session of the 7th edition of the BRICS seminar. And I would like to thank not only our speaker, Professor Ottaviano Canuto, to thank the audience for being with us today in this session, and also for the questions sent. And a special thanks to the team of researchers of the BRICS, who made an outstanding job, not only widening, but also deepening the connections of our research group with other institutions and researchers, not only in the BRICS countries, but also elsewhere. So this is a teamwork that could not have been achieved otherwise. So we now close this opening session, and the program goes along the week until the closing session on Friday. So join us for the next sessions. And Ottaviano Canuto, thanks again. And we hope to have you again with us in 1 year's time, so that we can reassess some of the planning that was made in these comments today. Thank you so much.
And congratulations to you all, to the team.
Thank you. And hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.